Oh, good evening, all. My name is David Brashear. I'm the director of the Muscarelle Museum of Art. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's installment of our Spring 2021 Muscarelle Exploration Series, Healing by Design. It's great to have you with us. I hope you've been enjoying some of the other programs we've had this spring. And before we get started, I wanted to just remind you of some of the upcoming programs we have that you can still take advantage of. So for all of you who are members of the Muscarelle, I want you to remember that this Saturday at 2 p.m., we have our good friend Elaine Ruffalo, our Florence-based art historian, coming to talk to us about Padua, saints, sinners, and with a real emphasis on the artist Giotto. Elaine is a fantastic speaker. I know many of you love her, and we look forward to seeing you with us on Saturday afternoon. We, of course, have had a tremendous series this spring, Healing by Design. As you all know, Muscarelle Explorations is our vehicle where we take a deep dive each semester into one sort of topical area. And this spring, our series, Healing by Design, is sponsored by the Williamsburg Landing, so we really appreciate their support. We've had a couple of art therapy workshops so far, led by Sarah Bellaccio, here at William and Mary. We have one remaining on April 16th. All of these sessions are virtual, so please sign up if you'd like to join in with us. We also have a really wonderful session coming up next week, The Healing Art of Meditation, and that's going to be led by Dr. Warren Buck, also an adjunct professor here at William and Mary, a wonderful man, March 23rd at 6 p.m. We'll be screening the film The Healing Wall from March 29th to April 1st. And then on April 1st, we'll have a panel discussion with Chris Kaczynski, who's the director of that film, and Jan Scruggs, who is the amazing life force behind the actual getting of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial whole program off the ground. He's a veteran and was a very strong spokesperson for the need for a memorial to honor those who had served in that war. And then we'll wrap up our Healing by Design sequence this spring with the architect Michael Arid. He is the man who designed the reflecting pools at the 9/11 Memorial in Lower Manhattan. Truly a sublime place. He's an amazing speaker, and we look forward to all of you joining us for that program as well. Now, as you all know, we have an upcoming renovation and expansion of the museum, hoping to break ground later this year. There is a lot of information coming together that I can share with you. We're beginning to have some webinars and information sessions. And as I did last week in one of our programs, I want to remind all of you that if you're interested in learning more sooner rather than later, please send me an email and I'll get you signed into one of our information sessions that will be upcoming in the next 4 to 6 weeks. As you also know, every spring now since 2011, we have our sequence Selected Topics in Architecture. They're a little bit more robust now in the time of pandemic. We had our first one when Jane Zaloga spoke to us about the architecture of Pienza in Italy. We have 2 more in the series remaining. Our good friend and William & Mary graduate, Dr. Jill Lord, will be joining us to talk about the important exhibition at MoMA in 1932 on the international style. And she'll be speaking about the making and meaning of the international style. And then I'll be back in May, on May 25th, to talk about some of the modern marvels of transportation architecture in Washington, D.C., the metro system, Dulles Airport, and of course, the remake of National Airport. But tonight, let's get to our main program, Healing Spaces on the Camino de Santiago in medieval and contemporary settings. We have 2 amazing guests with us, and I wanted to just give a brief introduction and tell you a little bit about who they are. Jessica Renee Streit is an associate professor of art and architectural history at the College of Charleston, where she teaches courses on medieval and Islamic art and architecture. She received her PhD in medieval studies from Cornell University. Her major field of study was Islamic art. She specializes in the art and architecture of the medieval Mediterranean, especially when viewed through the lenses of travel and cultural exchange. She's the author of the recent article, Pilgrimage and Liminality at the Cathedral of Notre Dame, La Puy-en-Velay, and the St. Michael Chapel in Aguilles. And then Kathleen Jenkins is the chair of the sociology department here at William & Mary and the co-director of William & Mary's Institute for Pilgrimage Studies. She received her PhD in sociology from Brandeis University and both her bachelor's and master's degrees in religious studies from Brown University. Her main areas of interest are sociology of religion, pilgrimage, families, and the relationship between therapeutic culture and religion. She's the author of Walking the Way Together, How Families Connect on the Camino de Santiago, released this month by Oxford University Press. We are amazingly honored to bring these two incredible people together tonight to spend time with us. I want to tell you that they're going to go in sequence and talk about their own studies of the Camino. And we'll reserve time for questions at the end of our guest comments. And I think you all know the protocol, but if you have a question, please post it in the chat or the Q&A section of this Zoom presentation, and we will get to it upon the conclusion of our second speaker's comments. So really, without further ado, I want to turn it over to our speakers and once again, thank them so much for being with us tonight.
All right, I think that means I am up. So if you'll give me a moment, I will share my screen and we can
stop and share. Here we go.
Okay, can everybody see? Does it look okay? You can see the screen and everything?
Yes, right. Looks fantastic.
Great. So thank you so much, David, for that kind introduction. And I'd also like to thank Lauren and the Muscarelle Museum in general for organizing this event. But my most special thanks is due to all of you who are Zooming in. Zoom fatigue is real. I know that it's real, and I'm so happy, just delighted that you're joining us tonight. So before I get started, I'd like to share a little bit about how I've organized my contribution to this event. Of course, both Dr. Jenkins' talk and my own deal with the Camino de Santiago. So I'll start with a brief introduction to that pilgrimage itinerary. After that, my talk has two halves. The first centers on the idea of the pilgrimage destination, a place of sacred power often concentrated into an object believed to perform miracles. The second considers the idea of the pilgrimage journey, the notion that pilgrimage spaces are designed to create feelings of arrival, but that they also direct pilgrims' attention toward places they've already visited or places they will visit yet. Two things kind of unite those halves. First, the desire for healing, both physical and spiritual, motivated many to journey to those sacred destinations. Second, I'm going to focus largely on the pilgrimage objects and architecture associated with the French city of Le Puy-en-Velay. These include the Cathedral of Notre Dame that you see here. I hope that my cursor is visible. And also the St. Michael Chapel, which you see here, dramatically perched as it is on a volcanic landform in the neighboring hamlet of Aiguille. But, here we go. Can my slide switch? Will my slide switch? Hello, there it is. Okay, but as promised, we'll start with the Camino de Santiago. The map on the screen shows the four major routes to Santiago de Compostela, routes that were established by the 12th century. Pilgrims from all over Europe would make their ways to one of four canonical starting cities. In fact, Le Puy itself lies at the beginning of one such route. No matter where one started, though, pilgrims' paths converged in the Pyrenees and ended up in Santiago de Compostela, the great shrine of Saint James, one of Jesus's disciples. In the Middle Ages, Santiago de Compostela was the third most important pilgrimage site for Latin Christians, right behind St. Peter's in Rome and Jerusalem itself. Of course, the site continued to receive pilgrims long after the Middle Ages ended, and as Dr. Jenkins will make clear, it's even experiencing somewhat of a revival today. So although the motivations for undertaking pilgrimage in the Middle Ages certainly varied, healing was one of the most important. Indeed, some of the earliest pilgrimage destinations, home to saints' relics or cult images, became famous as a result of their ability to heal. Stories of individual saints' healing powers were well known and sometimes collected and written down. One of the most famous of these collections, the Book of St. Faith on the screen, recounts how the saint cured various physical ailments with a special attention to blindness. St. Faith's shrine in Conch is located a bit further south along the same route to Santiago as Le Puy. It housed her impressive reliquary, which you see on the left, is one of my favorite objects. Its gem-studded exterior, as you can see, makes no attempt to replicate Faith's earthly appearance. She was, in fact, a little girl when she died. Instead, it offered medieval audiences a glorious vision of her heavenly form. At the same time, the reliquary testified to St. Faith's efficacy. Each stone represents a donation made in gratitude for or an expectation of a miracle. Turning now to Le Puy, we'll find similar associations with healing and similar objects. The site's foundation legend, set in late antiquity, recalls how a noble woman, recently converted to Christianity, suffering from a terrible fever, dreamed of a saintly figure. The apparition told her to climb Mount Ani, the low mountain currently known as Corneille Rock, which in this photograph is crowned with a 19th century statue of the Virgin and Child. Obeying the sacred order, the woman climbed the mountain, finding a large stone at its summit. As she laid her body across it, the fever lifted, and she was granted a second vision, this time of the heavenly host, presided over by the Virgin herself. The Virgin instructed the woman to safeguard the holy place, the site of her apparition, by building a sanctuary over it, a shrine that became the city's cathedral. Today, the bay to the left of the cathedral's apse, circled on the plan, houses what many believe to be Le Puy's legendary fever stone. Now, our earliest written record of the legend of Le Puy's healing stone dates to the 14th century, many hundreds of years after the events it describes. So like many legends, it's nearly impossible to verify. However, we do know with certainty that by the 10th century, Le Puy had a cathedral dedicated to the Virgin Mary, a cult statue of the Holy Mother housed therein, and that it was a significant pilgrimage destination. Sadly, Le Puy's medieval Virgin statue is no longer extant, but we do have similar examples from other nearby churches. Like the statue on the right, on view at the Metz cloisters in New York City, the Virgin of Le Puy almost certainly presented pilgrims with an image of majesty. She is regally enthroned, her own body serving as a throne for Jesus. Most statues of this type are executed in polychromed wood, though it's possible that Le Puy's Virgin was covered in a precious metal, like Sainte Baume on the right, or like St. Faith herself. In either case, the Christ child typically holds aloft a jewel-encrusted book. It's obviously missing from the Metz statue, but that jeweled aesthetic is carried through. Le Puy's Virgin also likely contained a cavity for relics. The wooden example from the Met certainly does, and obviously the reliquaries do too. These miraculous images, and here I would include Le Puy's lost Virgin and Child, share certain visual features in addition to the inclusion of precious metals or gems. Their somewhat oddly proportioned bodies sit stiffly, regally, rigidly, with the symmetry broken only by their hands, if at all. They also stare unflinchingly outward, meeting and returning the viewer's gaze. While these characteristics might seem a little strange to modern eyes, medieval audiences would have recognized them as a sort of visual shorthand, a set of conventions that manifested their sacred power. For the pilgrims that thronged to see them, These objects marked places where the earthly and heavenly worlds converge, places of concentrated holiness that conferred real benefits, including healing to those who drew near. In the Middle Ages, these statues and reliquaries were fully integrated into their physical environments, spaces that worked with the objects to engender feelings of arrival to that sacred destination. Remembering that Le Puy was one of the starting points to Santiago and that Conch was a stop along the way, I'll now turn to the idea of the Pilgrim Journey. So significantly, and here I am paraphrasing William and Mary's very own George Greenia, hello George, pilgrims experienced discomfort and even danger on the road. They were vulnerable to bandits, shady innkeepers, wild animals, local political violence, and of course, illness. They faced difficult terrain and punishing weather, often on an empty stomach. Many never returned. It should come as no surprise then that pilgrims settled debts and grudges and made confession before they left. On the road, you can see this on the left here, their travelers' clothes, their staff, and a small satchel would identify them as pilgrims. Often they decorated these items with small, inexpensive pilgrims badges purchased from individual shrines. While these outward symbols of being a pilgrim perhaps offered protection from the more ethically minded thieves, at the very least, a hat will shield you from the sun, and a well-timed wallop from a staff might drive off a lone wolf. Now, acknowledging these difficulties of the road helps us to understand two important points. First, pilgrims wouldn't risk this journey unless there was a real reward. Many sought physical healing, but spiritual healing, the forgiveness of sins, was an equally important motivator. And in fact, physical and spiritual sickness were linked by the medieval view that illness was an external manifestation of or a punishment for one's sins. The second point I'd like to make again relies on Professor Greenia's work, and that is we should understand the risks of pilgrimage as a feature of the experience itself. For pilgrims, the trials of the road were, or could be, a form of divine justice, punishment that God meted out in accordance to the gravity of the transgression. Taken together, both of these points suggest that for medieval pilgrims, long-term, difficult separation from daily life, in other words, the journey itself, was an effective means to heal their bodies and their souls. One of the defining features of that journey, the thing that brings a pilgrim both nearer to the saint and into harm's way, is near constant itineracy. There's movement toward a final destination, of course, but also toward a series of smaller waypoints, countless arrivals to, departures from cities, towns, and shrines, both large and small, not to mention movement through the wild spaces in between. Bringing us back to Le Puy, one of the most uniquely powerful aspects of Le Puy's pilgrimage architecture is that it stirs strong feelings of arrival, but also catches viewers in between the cathedral and the St. Michael Chapel, pushing their thoughts toward the next generation, maybe we're all thinking generationally here now, toward the next destination, while also reminding them of the places they left behind. So in the time that remains, I'll walk us through how they engender those feelings that mirror the itinerant experience of pilgrimage. So let's begin, as a pilgrim would, with the long view. On foot, from afar, pilgrims to Le Puy drank in a vision of telescoping sacralities, two holy cities, home to holy buildings. One of them encased an image of the Virgin, the other housed a collection of relics, but both of them had the power to heal spirit and body. Le Puy-en-Velay unique topography, its dramatically sited buildings and landforms, also generates this powerful anticipation of arrival. Gazing at them from a distance, the pilgrim knows soon I will be there. Now, once a pilgrim arrived, Le Puy's cathedral was the first stop. It was the area's principal destination, and a hospital next door ministered to poor and sick pilgrims and also sold pilgrims' badges. As you can see on the left, visitors arrive at the building's facade after climbing a large staircase leading to an enormous cavernous porch. Once inside that porch, over here on the right, another series of 5 short staircases beckon onward and upward, where pilgrims emerged not in the cathedral's west end, but rather right in its center. Climbing that final narrow set of stairs through this door here, visitors saw the space before them balloon. Their eyes lifted first to the crossing vaults on the left, through the cathedral's choir, and finally resting on the Virgin seated in the cathedral's apse. So this fellow right here has just kind of popped forth from those stairs. For pilgrims, the telescoping sacrality that they had seen from the countryside reached its dramatic conclusion. Our magisterial Virgin is enthroned, crowned, canopied by a small baldachin, and framed by the cathedral's architecture. All of these visual cues established not only that pilgrims had reached a destination, but that they were in sacred healing space. And yet, 2 early 13th century frescoes of St. Michael Archangel softly temper that sensation of forward movement, ascent, and arrival. The first, a bust-length image of the angel holding scepter and orb, looks down at the viewer from the underside of the porch's second transverse arch. A second fresco of the angel on the right, this time slaying the dragon, appears in the gallery of the cathedral's north transept. These images deserve a fuller discussion than I can give here, but they might have gently directed the pilgrim's mind toward the angel's chapel in Aigui, the next stop on their journey. This visual signposting echoes the persistent itineracy of the painting's audience, an itineracy that carried with it the ability to heal. The subtle pulling sensations of departure for Aigui, even as pilgrims were still in the cathedral, were eventually made manifest as they left the city. As late as the 16th century, as the image on the left shows, curtain walls and a stretch of open country clearly partitioned Aigui from its larger neighbor. The walk was short, but medieval pilgrims briefly returned to the road, a process made more concrete as they exited Le Puy's gates and crossed open fields. At the same time, the towering visibility of the St. Michael Chapel must have helped them anticipate the ascent to and arrival at the next destination. In Aigui, pilgrims climbed a small mountain, preparing to offer prayers to the angel and venerate a small cache of relics. But at the same time, they had many opportunities to recall their visit to Le Puy's Virgin. The Switchback Staircase that guides visitors up the mountain, you can see it on the upper right, is located on that mountain's southwestern side. And this location allows Le Puy and its cathedral, the view on the left, to remain in sight during the entire ascent. Now, having climbed those 269 stairs myself, let me assure you that the sheer exhaustion, perhaps my own form of divine punishment, encourages a slow pace. In fact, several evenly spaced platforms, landings, provide logical places to pause, catch your breath, and take in the view. Of course, that view itself could have triggered an act of remembrance for pilgrims who had already been to cathedral, tugging their minds away from Aigui and toward the majesty of Le Puy's Virgin. These reminders of that most recent stop on the itinerary intensified inside the St. Michael Chapel, and in fact, there's evidence that that intensification is by design. To understand this feature, we have to know a little bit about the chapel's construction history. So you see a plan here on the screen. Originally, and this is the part circled in yellow, the building consisted of a single-story, 12-foot square structure surrounded by 3 small apses. One of those apses has been removed here. In the 12th century, extensive renovations completely transformed the space. First, the chapel's portal was relocated from the western side, it used to be here, to the southeastern side here. Upon entering this portal, pilgrims occupied a short narthex. Its stairs, you can see those stairs here, lead to an ambulatory that terminates in a rather truncated side chapel. Back in the building's center, a short nave opens first to the sanctuary, the repurposed 10th century building, and then finally you can exit through that removed apse and enter a second floor gallery. That gallery is located directly above the new portal. So as one might expect, some of these changes to the St. Michael Chapel direct foot traffic. The ambulatory guides the pilgrim around the perimeter, with the side chapel, the sanctuary itself, and the second story gallery distributing 3 devotional focal points throughout the small building. But the renovations, and especially the relocation of the portal and the addition of the gallery, also redefined the spatial relationships between the chapel and the Police Cathedral. In the gallery, a pilgrim encounters a small eye-level oculus window. So I'm circling it here. Today, the window is filled with 19th century stained glass, but in the Middle Ages, peering through it revealed a vision of the Police Cathedral framed like a Tondo painting. Back downstairs, the chapel's new portal opens directly below. As I hope this photograph makes clear, exiting the building is an almost blinding experience. It's very disoriented when you kind of pop forth into daylight. But as your eyes adjust, you again settle again on that cathedral. So both of these views draws pilgrims' thoughts back toward the Virgin of Le Puy, reminding them of that important healing space and of the road they had traveled. As impressive as Le Puy and Aiguille were, pilgrims eventually left the cities for the open road. Before doing so, they might have enjoyed the full panorama afforded by the 12th century parapet that rings the St. Michael Chapel. Positioned high above the bucolic landscape, pilgrims who intended to continue their journey to Conch or to Santiago could familiarize themselves with the lay of the land, savoring Le Puy's unique topography even as they contemplated their departure. So, I'd like to conclude with the following thoughts about this remarkable pilgrimage topography. Perhaps most importantly, rather than thinking of the cathedral and the chapel as individual shrines, I hope to have shown how they formed part of a network of spaces. Both monuments draw pilgrims near with their towering visibility, while also offering glimpses of the next phase of their journey. But having said that, not all shrines are created equal. Clearly, Le Puy's cathedral was the region's principal destination, a status communicated by its size, its dramatic entrance, and its enthroned virgin, who received all of the visual trappings of sacred power. Leaving the cathedral behind, though, Aiguille emphasizes the journey. As pilgrims moved to and through the St. Michael Chapel, the site repeatedly presented them with views of the cathedral, the place they'd just been, and the road ahead. Crucially, both sites attend to the ways that medieval pilgrims sought to heal their bodies and their souls, through contact with the divine presence or through the open road. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Let me share my screen here. When I first read Jessica's work, I was struck really by her emphasis on the kinetic viewing experiences of medieval pilgrims. And my new ethnography, Walking the Way Together, focuses on pilgrims moving through the buildings and paths that make up the contemporary world of the Camino. I studied parents who walked with their young adult children, and in walking the way together, I explore the family experiences that I heard in talking to over 100 pilgrims, through informal interviews, walking and in Santiago, and also formal interviews. They were narratives of families making their way together through the Camino that most of them described really as bringing them closer to understanding each other. And they became closer to understanding through sharing spiritual experiences. Like many contemporary folks, they talked about spirituality in many different ways. Experiences with nature as a divine or mystical energy, or a larger sense of connection with others. And in the book, I tell their stories of planning to go on these journeys and what they saw as the Camino's spiritual and therapeutic promise. Most families talk to me about wanting to escape from routine attachments. They wanted to share an experience that was uninterrupted by digital ties. They wanted to be physically away together from their everyday obligations, and they wanted to learn more about each other. Some of them walked to heal from family conflict, others to find relief from anxiety, some to grieve for a son, a daughter, or a spouse. The majority of people that I interviewed were from the US and Canada, but I also interviewed families from Australia, Spain, the Netherlands, UK, Ireland, Germany, Sweden, South Africa, and the Philippines. They walked Camino paths from France. Some of them walked up from Portugal, and others from northern points in Spain, where historically pilgrims had arrived on boats from England and Ireland, a path called the English Way. I interviewed them on the paths as I was walking, also in Santiago as they arrived, and sometimes over the phone after they'd returned home. Some of them had walked a week, others a month. And they were among thousands of contemporary pilgrims who've walked the Camino in recent years. In 2019, about 340,000 people came to the official pilgrim's office to claim their certificate of completion, the Compostela accreditation to the pilgrimage of the tomb of St. James. That's an impressive figure, given that in 2004, that number was about 179,000. I want to share with you this evening family stories of moving through together 3 different elements of Camino structure: the cathedral in Santiago, everyday Camino spaces, and contemporary sacred buildings. I'll begin where many pilgrims end, at that end point, the cathedral in Santiago. This medieval structure added to and restored over the years, that pilgrims move toward, they move through, and then move away from, and that lies at the center of a city that's focused in many ways on welcoming pilgrims and offering hospitality. Not surprisingly, most of the families I interviewed from the US had seen Emilio Estevez's film, The Way. It's a film whose message really centers around family connection and the Camino's transformative and healing promise. And it pulled many of them to the Camino. For example, Anne, a mom from California, told me that after seeing the film, that's when she decided that she wanted to do it. After her husband died, who she had been caring for many years, she watched it again with her daughter, Hannah, who said, "Mom, that's going to be your birthday present. That's what we're going to do. We're going to do the Camino together." And they did. And one of the moments of connection that they talked about, that Anne described to me, was sitting with Hannah attending the Pilgrim's Mass and watching the Botafumeira swing, this large incense burner that swings during certain services and rises high up above the pews. It was a grand ritual that was showcased as well in what Anne called the movie. In Santiago, among arriving pilgrims and others who are visiting the cathedral, you can feel the anticipation and the spectacle, especially today, as all phones and tablets work to capture the event. Anne spoke of sharing it with Hannah. When the Botafomeira swings, we were both just unbelievably moved. I can't tell you the sense of gratitude and peace I felt from what we felt in our hearts at that moment. It was amazing. For some families, it wasn't the grand ritual featured in their story. That wasn't the grand ritual that was featured in their stories of moving through and being in this space. Some of them didn't have a chance to see it swing, but at the center of their stories were other material and community and religious aspects that they remembered about the space. I met Julie and Ed at a smaller English service mass held in the Soledad Chapel in the cathedral. And the next day, we met up for coffee and to talk about their Camino experience. Julie had convinced her dad to go on the Camino because she wanted to pull him away from his stressful work environment. This English service, it was a beautiful service, but Ed talked about being struck really at the larger Pilgrims Mass when they arrived in Santiago, that Catholics around the world, he said, were reading the same scripture that day that he was there. And he thought, well, this is a family after all, family meaning the Catholic people. He'd been told that in his home parish, but he never felt it as deeply. And Julie added that sitting in this beautiful space with all different kinds of people, it made our experience of the Camino deeper. Like many Catholics I talked to, the cathedral magnified this sense of family, shared identity. Family stories of connection also call attention really to the everyday Camino structures that they move through together. So the stone streets, the dirt paths, the bridges, smaller churches. And in their stories of moving through these everyday spaces, they talked about these spaces fostering spiritual intimacy, meaning a coming to understand and to feel each other's spiritual practice in a deeper way. I was struck, as this etching and the photo on the cover of my book suggests, by a popular pilgrim photo, Shadows on Paths. One method in my interviewing was to ask people if they had photographs to share, photographs of what they felt was most meaningful to them about their Camino journeys with their families. And they sent me many like these. When the light hit just right, their forms on the ground that they covered together. Bart, a father who walked with his son Charlie, said he'd gone on lots of hiking trips with his son, but that this one was different. The history, the space, he said, brought them deeper into conversation. He said they would talk about the old stones, and we talked about, what's that mean to you? He said, so we had some really depth of conversation. He said, they'd say together, we're walking right now where millions upon millions of pilgrims went. These were people that had a purpose. That energy still, it's flowing, it's bouncing off of you. Anne as well talked about the spiritual connection to the Camino everyday structures passing through. Every day you're walking side by side, as Charlie and Bart had done. There's moments of that comfortable silence, and then there's moment of great conversation. And she talked about the everyday structures passed through that she and her daughter Hannah had passed through. And she said, even if you're a religious person, just being in the element and coming across on a daily basis things involved in religious rituals, crosses, arrows, shells, bridges, all of that. There's just something about immersing yourself in that. The whole journey is just rich with those symbols. And by continuing it daily, what happens is you just become a part of it. You're not sitting listening to a mass or a sermon. It's just you're part of it, something bigger, older, longer. and stronger and more powerful than you are. And if you become open and vulnerable, then it can pour into you. The last element of the Camino structure that I want to share an example of from the book is Pilgrim Encounters with buildings that had been recently made into sacred structures, contemporary sacred buildings like the Hospital of the Soul, a village home in Castra Harris along the French Way. And I tell this story in more detail at the beginning of the book, but I wanted it to be the last experience that I point to here because it exemplifies how moving through such spaces, those designed for reflection, rise as important in pilgrim stories of healing and of revelation. I met Katie and her father, Jose, at a cafe one night after their Camino. I told them about my study and I asked them how they'd come to walk together. Jose said he'd walked several years ago with his son, who at the time was 33, and that they had had before that a difficult relationship. But in walking the Camino, he said, they became good friends. The Camino, this Camino, he said, was for Katie, although they were already close. Katie said she had anxiety, and she was hoping the Camino could help. Jose said they were a Catholic family. Katie said, well, she was more spiritual than religious. Was the Camino a spiritual walk for you? I asked. And she paused and her eyes teared up. And I started to realize that I'd asked a really difficult question. So I said she didn't have to answer, but she wanted to. And her dad and I waited. And then she told us what happened to her at the Hospital of the Soul. I had some energy left after walking one day, so I went out to see the town we were in, and I saw this building with a bike outside of it and flowers, and it said Hospital of the Soul. It had music playing, a place to make tea, meditation pillows, photos on the wall with quotes that I read. It said not to take pictures of anything, so I didn't. I just sat on a pillow after looking around for a while. There was nobody there. I felt calm. I stayed there like that for about 45 minutes and felt detached from things and had this spiritual experience, not religious. It's hard to explain, but where you feel the presence of God. I was in this room and there was no one there and no one talking and no phones. And it was the first time in my life where I felt like I was alone, where I felt peace. She said, I went back the next day. It was so amazing. I went back to find the friend that we had been walking with for a few days. I wanted to show her the place. I found her and took her back, but it had changed. She brought her camera and phone, and we were talking to each other, and she wanted to take pictures. So she took pictures, and then I took pictures too. I took pictures of the quotes on the wall. And the room was different. I didn't feel anything like before. Being by myself there, I think that was what made it spiritual. After she told the story, her father said, that's it. That's what I wanted her to feel. But Katie said, I don't know how to get it back. On the Camino, she said, I used all the media. I admit it, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. And then she asked me, how do you think we disconnect? As if, because I was a sociologist, somehow I had an answer. For the most part, the experiences of moving through the Camino structure that I listened to over 6 years were stories about connection, of how moving together, walking, experiencing Camino spaces could bring closeness and shared values. And as many of these families said, to have memories that no one else could truly understand because they were the ones who experienced it, who felt it together. But there were also stories of disconnection, memories of family members who had made a decision to leave and walk alone because of an argument, or with newfound friends that they wanted to walk with, or digital forces were at work in some of these stories of disconnection. One mother's daughter was drawn back into a traumatic social media conflict, and Wi-Fi was everywhere, so she couldn't escape it, and that got in the way of them connecting with each other and connecting with other pilgrims. Digital worlds are now part of the Camino structure, from planning apps to capturing sacred moments. As people move through the Camino, many travel through digital spaces as well. In fact, 14 of the families that I interviewed talked about working together to discipline digital habits so that the everyday world would not creep too far into their experience. Digital expectations in 2021 infuse almost every component of pilgrimage practice: planning, expectations, the rituals themselves, the structures that support the practice, and the tools for remembering sacred experience. In the book, I argue that people who are concerned with the social and relational good that pilgrimage practices can bring should also think about these digital forces and think about their impact on connective and healing practice. And people use digital practices and devices to enhance spiritual attachments as they move through pilgrimage routes. And structures like the Camino are really stronger and more accessible in many ways today because of the cultivation of pilgrimage practitioners through digital spaces. Digital technologies can also provide tools for creating more accessible pilgrim structures, more opportunities for people to walk together, to connect, to learn from each other. Still, the stories I heard reinforce the importance of being reflective about such forces in the pursuit of sacred practice and relational connection. I wanted to just leave you with a few words from the end of my book. Pilgrim structures are marked with spiritual guideposts, symbols, and/or words that point a direction for physical movement: a shell, a yellow arrow, contemplative words, prayers, invitations to story one's own experience. Katie's experience was so powerful that she feared its loss from the lure of digital ties. I did not have answers for her. I told her that I too was trying to manage technology and that a lot of pilgrims I talked to were making concentrated efforts to construct tech-free time. It's okay, she assured me, not to know the answer. The Camino teaches you over time. I hope that my efforts over 6 years to understand and interpret the spiritual goals and social forces at work in the experiences of Katie and Jose and the many others who shared their Camino stories with me have provided some insight about family, spirituality, and transformative practices in a world fraught with contradictions and uncertainties borne by social inequalities and the pervasive and monumental shifts in relationships that digital technologies have engendered. As I work on this concluding chapter in the spring of 2020, families across the globe are feeling a range of effects from COVID-19, and the Camino de Santiago has been shut down. In the media discord in the US, I hear voices of suffering, illness, hunger, and fear, shaped by economic position, racism, and domestic violence. These voices exist alongside a chorus of those who describe walking the now hushed streets of their neighborhoods, awed by their discovery of the simple goodness of a long walk together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Streit and Dr. Jenkins. Really fantastic comments. And I'm really happy that we situated this both historically and in a contemporary kind of way. So I'm going to try not to ask a million questions because I have about a million questions I want to ask the both of you. But I'll just start with, to me, I'm not altogether understanding how this became the length of the journey that it became. I mean, obviously, this was something that Dr. Streit told us about as happening in earlier times, and the various paths that lead to that gathering point in the Pyrenees and then marching beyond. But I'm just curious if either of you can share any additional details on how this became the long journey that it is. It obviously was a bunch of short journeys maybe that began to weave themselves together at some earlier moment in time.
I have a very unsatisfactory answer, and that is that I simply don't know. I simply don't know how it came to be. I mean, the fact that, somewhere on the European continent, Christians believe that one of the disciples of Jesus was buried. I mean, like, that's a major draw. Of course, St. Peter's in Rome has that same kind of draw of a companion of Jesus. But, I know that, our earliest recorded pilgrimage to Compostela, it happens sometime, I think, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, in the 9th century. But I mean, it's almost certain that there was pilgrimage that was happening far before that. But how the ways became kind of linked and canonical, I just don't know. We do have from the Middle Ages a description. It's sometimes it's called the Pilgrim's Guide, sometimes it's called the Codex Calixtanus, but it's basically like a narration from a medieval author narrating like these are the points that you go through. And, at some points they give some very unfavorably colorful descriptions of moving through the Basque Country, for example. But I wish that I had a better answer, but that's all I got. I don't know how it kind of came to be these routes in sort of this established way.
I don't have a historical answer to that.
It's sort of fascinating because, as we know, at least about Christianity, because that's my background, we know that pilgrimages were an important part of medieval Europe, and there were many destinations for a pilgrim to seek out. So it's interesting that this one has sort of maintained its more traditional approach. Now we make our pilgrimage to Rome by flying there or taking the train, whereas people in medieval times did the walk because they wanted to get to St. Peter's or wherever. So it is just interesting. I have a question from one in our audience, and I know some in our audience have done the pilgrimage, or at least parts of it, and so they're probably thrilled to hear what you all have to say. But for Mary Jane Dunn, for Jessica, you speak specifically of healing as an important aspect of medieval pilgrimage, but in examining the miracle tales of Saint Foy and Santiago, healing is a relatively small percentage of the miracles related. Jerusalem and St. Peter's in Rome are also noted for healing. None of them are noted thaumaturgic places or saints. I may not be getting that right. Is it possible that we modern scholars assume a lack of sophistication of pilgrims in their search for medical miracles and miss the importance of the true spiritual religious goals of the pilgrims that are supported by the architecture and the art of the pilgrimage sites themselves? So I think this is sort of asking the healing of body versus the healing of spirit, potentially.
Yeah, there's obviously quite a bit to unpack there, but I think that it is possible that we sort of overestimate the kind of physical aspects of healing. I mean, with Saint Faith in particular, I guess one of the things that always strikes me is how the whole codex itself, sort of like the first miracle story, is the story of how this guy Guibert is blinded, and then he's healed by Saint Faith, and then he's re-blinded. Like, it's kind of a long story that I don't need to tell in its entirety. But I am open to the idea that perhaps modern scholars overemphasize the physical in relation to the spiritual. I don't dispute that. I'm perfectly happy to to entertain that suggestion. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. Another question from our audience: do you see a difference between the therapeutic nature of the Camino de Santiago and other hiking routes? And before you answer, I'll just say I've fortunately had the habit of taking my children as they've been young adults, sort of on a one-on-one basis, to oftentimes a lot of hikes into some of our great national parks in America. And there's a certain spirituality, as you mentioned, Kay, that people feel just on seeing the open space and the natural wonders, even along the Camino. But you know, we sort of have that same, you can have that same effect doing other things, like making a long hike in a national park. So I'm just curious, you know.
Sure. I think one of the differences is, and of course this can happen on a hike in a national park as well, but the communal part of the Camino, which I didn't get to talk about as much in the short amount of time, but meeting other pilgrims, talking to other pilgrims, listening to other pilgrims' stories, and walking together, sharing meals, praying together. And that communal nature of it is not always, and moving along the structure of the Camino. Often in pilgrim hostels, there are communal dinners, and you spend a lot of time with other pilgrims. And it's that kind of connection to other people. And for the families that I talked with, for them to experience that together as a family, to make friends, you know, mom and daughter making the same new friend that they then communicate with for years. So that can happen on a hike, but it's built into the structure of the Camino.
Interesting. And I think you've both communicated that. Your friend George Greenia, both of you, is asking a question. Professor Jenkins, can you speak to the experience of families moving through the outdoors through nature? And maybe that's a little bit of what you were just talking about.
Well, I think, and George has heard this story, but one of the Anne and Hannah, one of the stories I told, they also talked about walking through nature in one powerful moment where they were caught in a storm, and the rain was pouring into them, and the thunder was really hitting them in a very strong way. And being caught in a storm, being caught in nature is and feeling nature in a very different way, I think is certainly, I would point to that for sure. I mean, I showed the picture of the person laying on the bridge, and that sort of is, you know, being a part of the structure yourself.
So here's one more question from Anne first. For Kathleen, did you speak with non-Christians who were walking the Camino? If so, how did their experience differ? How about non-Catholics? How central is Catholicism to the experience of the journey? I'll talk about the formal interviews. I did about 78 formal interviews, and 22 of those were Catholic and also identified as spiritual, 16 Protestants. I interviewed one pagan, one Buddhist, and I think the rest of them identified as spiritual. And so it was very much like other scholars have talked about, very much a spiritual journey. Yeah, the obviously the Catholic piece is there, but there's so many places to connect in other ways that I think many of the stories I heard focus on a range of different opportunities of feeling spiritual connection. Great. And I'm going to ask one last question to the both of you, and maybe related to your period of study in all of this. How is it, or how was it, that people who decided to make the journey, to make the pilgrimage, were willing to commit that block of time of a great amount of significance to actually accomplish? I mean, as you noted, Case, some people take the walk for a week, but others commit to doing the whole thing. I mean, how is it that people then and now came to decide on that time commitment and the disruption to their lives that it likely caused?
Well, I think I'll just, we can move chronologically, I guess, again, but, you know, for the medieval period, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong here, but we don't have that same opportunity to be like, you know, hey, Pilgrim, why are you doing this? We don't have a lot of kind of, you know, there aren't like diary records or something like, today I decided I'm going to go on pilgrimage. But, you know, I think that and this is maybe another kind of connects to the sort of previous question. I think that pilgrimage in the Middle Ages was something that was a frequent, maybe a normalized, kind of just a part of spiritual practice, a part of living your life as a religious person. Obviously, you got real spiritual benefit and physical benefit sometimes from going on pilgrimage. And so, you know, if making the journey was what you did in order to accomplish that, then you made the journey. And so I think that it was perhaps more of a part of people's lived experience, more of a common part of people's lived experience than perhaps is easily intuitable by us modern people today. So again, maybe an unsatisfying answer, but I think that's probably the best I can do.
Sure.
I think it's an interesting question in contemporary context, especially in thinking about our digital worlds. I'll give you an example. A father who was running his entire business and taking an online degree, moving forward in an online degree. And he had a time every day on the Camino when his tech time when he would work. And so this allowed people to bring their everyday life with them, which is, we might say in many ways is, you know, working very much against that liminal kind of space that we're trying to create. A lot of people can't find the time, and they talk about how rare it is to have this time. And I talk about that a little bit in the interviews, like, oh, they're just graduating and they're going on to school. And so now I'm going to grab this time when we all can actually do this. And we can take this time to be together. I haven't managed to be able to orchestrate that with my 3 kids. So
maybe in the
it's not
future.
an easy task.
Maybe in the future sometime. Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Streit and Dr. Jenkins, for your time tonight. I think it's a really interesting intersection of more ancient times and more modern times and how things have changed along the Camino. I want to thank Lauren Green, our assistant curator at the Muscarelle, for producing tonight's program. And I want to thank all of you, our members and friends of the museum, for joining in tonight for this amazing conversation. Hope you all have a wonderful evening, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.